People killed.
If this deal, if Zelensky rejects this deal, like, is there a timeline? Is there a point at which you say, okay?
Well, he's going to have to get on the ball and start accepting things. You know, when you're losing, because you're losing.
What does it mean to you to hear that during this peace process, the President of the United States is attacking your president and European allies, but not Russia or President Putin?
Hello, Sarah, and thank you so much for having me. It is indeed painful because I'm sure it's not only American people who are watching this. There are people fighting at the front line, risking their life for democracy, for Europe, who are hearing such a harsh thing from President of the United States, one of our strongest allies, and it's just simply not true. It tries to be a self-fulfilling.
I need to write this commentary now with all the context I've gathered. Listen to what you've just witnessed, because this is the moment when American moral authority collapsed into rubble, right before your eyes, and you need to understand the enormous crushing weight of what's happening here. Not tomorrow, not next week, but right now, in this excruciating present tense, where a Ukrainian member of parliament, Kira Ruddick, sits on CNN trying to explain to an American audience why it's devastating beyond measure to watch the President of the United States attack Ukraine and Zelensky, while somehow, mysteriously never directing a single syllable of criticism toward Vladimir Putin and his blood-soaked regime that has been bombing hospitals and schools and apartment buildings for nearly 4 years. Tensions are mounting between Trump and Zelensky after the White House leader accused Ukraine's head of state of not even reading U.S. peace proposals yet. And what we're watching unfold is not diplomacy but something far more sinister. Something that should make every person who believes in democracy and human dignity feel physically ill, because this is appeasement dressed up in the language of deal-making. This is Munich 1938 repackaged for the reality television presidency. Ukrainian President Zelensky faces growing pressure from the U.S. to accept major territorial losses and other concessions in Trump's peace plan, and Ukrainians still think aspects of the current U.S. plan favor Moscow, and that the U.S. is pushing Zelensky much harder than they're pushing Russian President Vladimir Putin. Think about what that means for a moment and let it sink all the way into your bones. The United States of America, the supposed beacon of freedom and democracy, is actively pressuring the victim of an unprovoked invasion to surrender territory to the aggressor, while giving that aggressor kid gloves treatment, and Ukrainian officials say it felt like the U.S. was trying to sell them the Russian desire to take the whole of Donbass, and that the Americans wanted Zelensky to accept all of it. This isn't neutral arbitration. This is acting as Putin's sales representative. This is moral bankruptcy wearing a suit and tie. And here's where it gets even more grotesque, because the 28-point plan looks like a brainchild of the Kremlin, taking all the Russian official goals and presenting it to Kyiv as the American peace plan. And there is no peace process but rather the transmission of surrender demands from Russia with the active facilitation of the United States. Read that again, because it's not hyperbole, it's not partisan exaggeration, it's what experts at Chatham House are saying out loud. The peace plan that Trump is ramming down Ukraine's throat was essentially written in Moscow, refined through shuttle diplomacy with Putin's cronies, and now being presented as if it's some kind of benevolent American mediation, when it's actually just laundering Russian imperial ambitions through the prestige of the American presidency. But wait, because it gets worse, and you need to hear every single detail of how this betrayal is being orchestrated. Trump has claimed that Russia has the upper hand in the war, and Ukraine is losing, which is remarkable not because it's strategic analysis, but because it's adopting the Kremlin's framing wholesale, accepting Putin's narrative as if it's objective reality rather than what it actually is, which is propaganda designed to demoralize Ukrainian resistance and convince Western publics to abandon support for democracy. When Trump says Ukraine is losing, he's not describing military reality, he's trying to create a political reality where abandoning Ukraine seems pragmatic, rather than what it actually is, which is cowardice cloaked in the language of realism. And you heard it in the clip. You heard Kira Ruddick's voice breaking slightly when she talked about soldiers at the front line, hearing these words from the President of the United States, who is supposed to be their ally, soldiers who are quite literally dying for the principle that authoritarian aggression should not be rewarded, that borders matter, that sovereignty isn't something you can just erase with enough artillery shells and cruise missiles. These are human beings putting their bodies between their families and Putin's war machine, and the President of the United States is telling them they need to get on the ball and accept that they're losing. The psychological warfare embedded in that language is staggering. The way it shifts blame onto Ukraine for not capitulating fast enough, rather than onto Russia for launching a genocidal war of conquest in the first place. Now let's talk about what's really happening beneath the surface, because this isn't just about one terrible policy decision. This is about a comprehensive realignment of American foreign policy, away from supporting democracy and toward accommodating authoritarianism wherever it's convenient for personal relationships and business interests. Trump is dispatching two of his highest-profile diplomats to Moscow, and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff's portfolio quickly grew to include efforts to end Russia's war in Ukraine. But who exactly is Witkoff? He's a real estate developer, Trump's friend, someone with no diplomatic experience whatsoever, who has been conducting negotiations with Russian officials without the presence of experienced diplomats, or even at times U.S. note-takers. Think about what that means. Think about the fact that the peace terms for a war that will determine the future of European security and the international rules-based order are being negotiated by a real estate guy in rooms with no American diplomats present and no official record of what's being discussed. And it gets even more alarming, because Witkoff put together an initial 28-point plan that had heavy Russian input if not authorship, giving his Russian counterpart Kirill Dmitriev 2 bites at the negotiating apple. So Russia gets to help write the peace plan, and then negotiate over the peace plan they helped write, which is like letting the defendant draft the plea deal, and then haggle over its terms. This isn't diplomacy, it's a farce, and Trump wants the Ukraine war to end, mainly because he sees it as an irritant preventing the normalization of U.S.-Russia ties, especially the planned business deals between his entourage and the Kremlin's cronies. There it is. There's the actual motivation stripped of all the pretense about peace and pragmatism. Trump wants this war over so his associates can make money in Russia. Full stop. End of story. And Ukrainian lives are just inconvenient obstacles to those lucrative arrangements. But maybe you're thinking this is just how negotiations work. Maybe you're thinking that of course peace requires compromise and difficult concessions. Maybe you're thinking that calling this appeasement is too harsh. So let me walk you through what this peace plan actually demands, because the details matter, and they reveal the full scope of the betrayal. The 28-point plan would force Kyiv to give up additional territory in the east, cap the size of its military, and agree it will never join NATO, and Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk would be recognized as de facto Russian. Kherson and Zaporizhia would be frozen along the line of contact, and Ukrainian forces would withdraw from the part of Donetsk Oblast that they currently control, with this withdrawal zone considered a neutral demilitarized buffer zone internationally recognized as territory belonging to the Russian Federation. Let that sink in. Let every single word of that register in your consciousness. Ukraine would be forced to withdraw from territory it currently controls, and that territory would then be recognized as Russian, which means Ukraine would be giving Putin more than he has already taken through force. This isn't a compromise. This is rewarding aggression with bonus territory. This is teaching every would-be authoritarian on the planet that if you invade your neighbors and kill enough people and cause enough suffering, eventually the United States will pressure the victim to give you not only what you conquered, but extra land on top of it as a sweetener for signing the deal. The precedent this sets is catastrophic. The message it sends is that international law is dead, and might makes right, and the strong do what they can, while the weak suffer what they must. And here's what makes this even more unconscionable. Because Trump and his envoys aren't just pressuring Ukraine, they're doing it with a ticking clock and ultimatums designed to prevent Ukraine from building European support for resistance. Trump's envoys have given Zelensky a new deadline to respond to the proposed peace plan, with Zelensky having just days to decide whether to accept the U.S. plan, which would require Ukraine to cede territory to Russia. And Ukrainian officials said they feel the U.S. is trying to peel Zelensky away from the European leaders so they can pressure him more effectively. This is classic abuser behavior, isolating the victim and creating artificial time pressure to prevent them from seeking help or building support networks. The dynamic infuriates some in the White House, who see the Europeans as a major obstacle to a deal. Yes, you heard that right. The Trump administration sees European democracies trying to support Ukraine as obstacles, sees sovereign nations trying to defend the principle that aggressive war should not be rewarded as problems to be overcome, rather than allies to be respected. This tells you everything about whose side Trump is really on in this conflict. And it's not Ukraine's side, and it's not Europe's side, and it's not democracy's side. When you view the democratic world's resistance to capitulation as an obstacle, you've already chosen authoritarianism. Now let's connect this to the broader pattern, because this isn't happening in a vacuum, and it's not an isolated incident of poor judgment. The Trump administration's national security strategy says Europe is strategically and culturally vital to the U.S., but slams allies over their handling of Russia-Ukraine, and accuses their minority governments of trying to trample on basic principles of democracy to suppress opposition, while calling it a core interest to negotiate an expeditious cessation of hostilities in Ukraine. The sheer audacity of this, the projection, the gaslighting. Trump is attacking European democracies for supposedly trampling democratic principles, while he himself is trying to force Ukraine to surrender its sovereignty and territorial integrity, while he's the one cozying up to Putin and Xi and every authoritarian strongman on the planet. The inversion of reality here is Orwellian in its completeness. And you know what the most infuriating part is? Trump keeps pretending this is about ending suffering and saving lives, as if his motivation is humanitarian concern rather than what it obviously is, which is personal affinity for Putin and business interests, and a fundamental ideological alignment with authoritarian power. If Trump actually cared about Ukrainian lives, he would be providing them with the weapons they need to defend themselves effectively. He would be tightening sanctions on Russia until Putin's war machine grinds to a halt. He would be building the international coalition to make the costs of aggression so high that Putin has no choice but to withdraw. But he's not doing any of that. Instead, he's claiming that at some point size will win, generally, expressing frustration with the apparent lack of progress, as if Ukraine's resistance to subjugation is an irritating delay, rather than a heroic defense of everything liberal democracy supposedly stands for. Let's also talk about what Trump is not saying, because the silences here are as revealing as the words. Where is Trump's condemnation of Russian war crimes? Where is his outrage at the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, at the kidnapping of Ukrainian children, at the torture chambers and mass graves that Ukrainian forces find in every liberated territory? Where is his fury at Putin for launching this war in the first place? It doesn't exist. It's completely absent from his rhetoric, and that absence tells you everything. Trump said Russia is fine with the deal, and despite Trump's suggestion that Moscow was fine with the most up-to-date version, the Kremlin has indicated otherwise, which means Trump is lying to create the impression of diplomatic progress, claiming Russia is on board when Russia keeps demanding more concessions. This is what hostage negotiation looks like, when the negotiator is secretly working for the hostage taker, constantly pressuring the victim's family to pay more ransom while telling them the kidnapper is being very reasonable. Negotiations led by the United States have whittled the original 28 points to 20 but whittling down a surrender document doesn't make it not a surrender document, it just makes it a slightly shorter surrender document. The fundamental structure remains the same, which is that Ukraine gives up territory and sovereignty and security, and gets in exchange some vague promises that Russia will maybe possibly not attack again, even though Russia has violated every agreement it's ever signed with Ukraine, including the Budapest Memorandum that was supposed to guarantee Ukrainian security, exchange for giving up nuclear weapons. Think about that historical parallel for a moment, because it's crucial to understanding why this matters far beyond Ukraine. In 1994, Ukraine gave up the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal in exchange for security guarantees from the United States, Russia, and the United Kingdom. 20 years later, Russia annexed Crimea, and now Trump is asking Ukraine to trust that this time Russia will honor its commitments. This time the security guarantees will work, even though all the evidence of history screams that authoritarian regimes break promises whenever it's convenient, and that the only language they understand is strength, not pieces of paper with signatures. Every non-nuclear state watching this debacle is learning the lesson that giving up your weapons in exchange for Western security guarantees is suicidal, that the only way to guarantee your survival is through your own military power, because America under Trump will abandon you the moment it becomes inconvenient to keep supporting you. And Kira Ruddick knows this. You can hear it in her voice in the clip. You can see it in her face when she talks about how painful it is to hear the American president attacking Ukraine while saying nothing about Russia. She knows that the most painful aspect of the Oval Office interaction was that Trump was saying that him having relations with Putin is enough of a security guarantee, but on behalf of Ukrainian people, they are not accepting the relations between Trump and Putin as a security guarantee. This is the core of the issue right here, distilled to its essence. Trump thinks his personal relationship with Putin is sufficient protection for Ukraine, as if authoritarians honor their commitments because of friendship rather than because of consequences, as if Putin's word means anything when his entire political career is built on deception and betrayal. This is the same delusion that led to Munich in 1938, when Chamberlain thought he could trust Hitler because of their gentleman's agreement, when Western leaders convinced themselves that appeasing totalitarian aggression would satisfy the aggressor's ambitions rather than whetting them. We know how that story ended. We know that every concession to Hitler made him more confident and more aggressive until finally the democracies had no choice but to fight a war that was far more devastating than it would have been had they drawn a line earlier. And here we are again watching it all play out with slightly different actors and slightly different geography, but the same fundamental dynamic of democracies being asked to sacrifice their principles and their allies on the altar of a peace that will not hold because it's built on the foundation of rewarding aggression. What's particularly insidious about Trump's approach is the way he frames Ukraine's resistance as the problem rather than Russia's aggression. When you're losing, he says, as if the outcome is predetermined and Ukraine should just accept defeat gracefully, as if there's something unreasonable about a democracy defending itself against genocidal invasion. This rhetoric does Putin's work for him by demoralizing Ukrainian resistance and weakening Western support, by making continued defense seem futile rather than necessary. And it's especially galling coming from the president of a country that has never faced foreign invasion on its soil in living memory, that has never had to make the choice between national extinction and continued resistance, that has the luxury of treating this war as an abstract diplomatic problem rather than an existential struggle. Republican criticism in Congress is growing, with Representative Don Bacon saying the president's appeasement plan to Russia is forcing his hand, and that he considered resigning from Congress in protest over the recently proposed peace plan, when even Republicans are calling it an appeasement plan, when conservative members of Congress are threatening to resign over how atrocious the policy is. You know something truly disturbing is happening. Senator Mitch McConnell likened the plan to a capitulation like Biden's abandonment of Afghanistan. And as much as I disagree with McConnell on virtually everything, he's absolutely right about this comparison, because both scenarios involve the United States abandoning allies who trusted us, leaving them to face enemies who will show no mercy. But here's what should terrify every single person who cares about democracy and human rights and international law. Here's the real bombshell that should be keeping you up at night. Putin has never negotiated in good faith since his first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, instead consistently demanding maximalist aims to secure Ukrainian territory and erase its sovereignty. And it appears Putin again offered nothing on the key issue of territory and security for Ukraine. So Trump is pressuring Ukraine to make enormous concessions while Putin is offering nothing in return, while Russia continues to bomb Ukrainian cities and kill civilians and commit war crimes on an industrial scale. This is not negotiation. This is extortion, with the United States as the enforcer rather than the protector. And you want to know why this is happening now, why Trump is pushing this so hard. Follow the money, because it's always about the money, with Trump and his circle. The plan includes economic components that would see sanctions on Russia lifted, the US and Russia agreeing to partner long-term in areas like AI and mining, Russia returning to the G8, and frozen Russian funds invested in a separate US-Russian investment vehicle that will implement joint projects in specific areas. There it is, the corruption at the heart of this whole grotesque arrangement. This isn't a peace plan, it's a business plan. It's a scheme to lift sanctions and funnel money into joint Russian-American investment vehicles, while Ukrainian blood is still soaking into the soil of Donbass and Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. Trump and his associates want access to Russian markets and Russian resources and Russian money, and Ukrainian sovereignty is just an inconvenient obstacle to those lucrative arrangements. Most of the participants in the last round of talks in Moscow were business people, 2 Americans and 1 Russian, which tells you everything about what kind of negotiation this actually is. It's not diplomatic, it's transactional. It's a bunch of businessmen trying to carve up Ukraine's future so they can profit from the aftermath while pretending they're peacemakers. Now I want you to imagine for a moment what it must be like to be a Ukrainian soldier in a trench right now, exhausted and cold and terrified, but holding the line anyway, because you believe in your country and your freedom and the principles that are supposed to define the democratic world. And then you hear the President of the United States, the leader of the country that promised to stand with Ukraine, telling your president to get on the ball and accept defeat, telling the world that you're losing and need to give up territory to your invaders, attacking your president while saying nothing critical about the man who ordered the invasion that killed your friends and destroyed your cities. The betrayal of that moment, the psychological devastation, the sense that you've been abandoned by the very powers that claim to represent your values. That's what Trump is doing to Ukraine every single day with this grotesque pressure campaign. And Kira Ruddick is right to call it a self-fulfilling prophecy, because that's exactly what Trump is trying to create. By declaring Ukraine is losing, by pressuring them to accept defeat, by undermining Western support for continued resistance, Trump is trying to manufacture the very outcome he claims is inevitable. This is ideological warfare disguised as realism, it's defeatism packaged as pragmatism, and it serves Putin's interests far more effectively than any Russian propaganda campaign possibly could, because it's coming from the President of the United States, and therefore carries the weight of American power and prestige behind it. Let's also talk about the obscene asymmetry in how Trump treats Ukraine versus how he treats Russia, because the contrast could not be more stark or more revealing. Ukraine, the victim of aggression, gets publicly humiliated and pressured and given ultimatums with artificial deadlines. Russia, the aggressor, gets private meetings with no diplomats present, and business deals and promises of sanctions relief, and a return to the G8, as if launching a genocidal war of conquest is just a minor diplomatic hiccup that can be smoothed over with some trade agreements. Trump said Russia is fine with the deal, implying they would rather have the whole country but are willing to compromise, treating Russia's supposed willingness to not conquer all of Ukraine as if it's a generous concession rather than the bare minimum expectation of not committing total genocide. The moral universe Trump inhabits is so inverted, so completely backwards, that aggression gets rewarded while resistance gets punished, that starting wars makes you a valuable negotiating partner while defending yourself makes you difficult and unreasonable. This is the logic of the schoolyard bully who punishes the victim for fighting back, but never disciplines the bully for starting the fight in the first place. And it's not just morally bankrupt, it's strategically catastrophic because it tells every revisionist power on earth that aggression works, that if you're willing to kill enough people and break enough things eventually, the democracies will pressure your victim to give you what you want. China is watching this and learning lessons about Taiwan. Iran is watching this and learning lessons about its neighbors. North Korea is watching this and learning lessons about South Korea. Every authoritarian regime with territorial ambitions is watching Trump abandon Ukraine and concluding that American security guarantees are worthless, that alliances with Washington will be discarded the moment a U.S. president decides it's inconvenient to honor them, that the only way to ensure your security is through nuclear weapons and military might, because you certainly can't trust America to keep its word. This is what the collapse of American credibility looks like in real time. This is how hegemonic powers lose their legitimacy and their ability to shape international order, not through military defeat, but through moral bankruptcy and the betrayal of their own stated principles. And future historians studying the decline of American power will point to this moment, to Trump pressuring Ukraine to surrender while Putin continues his invasion, as one of the key inflection points when American leadership became American complicity in authoritarian aggression. You want to know what's truly at stake here beyond Ukraine's borders and territorial integrity? It's the entire post-World War II international order built on the principle that aggressive war is illegal, that borders cannot be changed by force, that sovereignty matters, and international law has meaning beyond just words on paper. That order has been eroding for years through Iraq and Libya and Syria and other American foreign policy disasters, but Trump's betrayal of Ukraine could deliver the final killing blow, because it would definitively prove that the rules don't matter, that might makes right, that the strong can devour the weak, and the international community will eventually pressure the victim to accept their subjugation. And here's what makes me rage with the fire of 1,000 suns. Here's what should make every person who claims to care about justice absolutely livid. Ukraine didn't ask for this war. Ukraine wasn't threatening Russia. Ukraine was trying to build a normal European democracy with functioning institutions and rule of law and economic development. Russia invaded because Putin cannot tolerate the existence of a successful democracy on his border that might give his own people ideas about demanding freedom and accountability from their government. This war is fundamentally about whether people have the right to choose democracy over authoritarianism, and Trump is telling Ukraine that no, actually, you don't have that right. Actually, you need to accept permanent subjugation to Russian influence because ending the war is more important than preserving your freedom. The clip you just watched is a microcosm of everything wrong with Trump's foreign policy, and everything dangerous about the MAGA movement's fundamental affinity for authoritarian power over democratic values. Kira Ruddick sitting there trying to explain why it's devastating to hear the American president attack Ukraine while saying nothing about Russia, trying to maintain diplomatic composure while her country is being bombed and her compatriots are dying, and the United States is actively undermining their ability to resist. The pain in her voice, the careful way she chooses her words to avoid directly attacking Trump while still making clear how completely unacceptable his position is, the dignity she maintains while being betrayed by the country that promised to stand with Ukraine. This is what moral clarity looks like. This is what principled resistance to authoritarianism sounds like, and it's coming from a Ukrainian parliamentarian, while the President of the United States traffics in appeasement and surrender, dressed up as deal-making. The inversion is complete. The superpower that once defined itself through opposition to totalitarianism now actively collaborates with it, and the small country fighting for its survival has to explain to Americans why democracy and sovereignty actually matter. Zelensky has responded to mounting pressure by reiterating that Ukraine will not concede land to its aggressor, saying Russia insists that we give up territories, but we of course do not want to give anything away, because that is exactly what we are fighting for, and noting that the Americans today are looking for a compromise. Listen to the restraint in Zelensky's language, the way he frames it as Americans looking for compromise, rather than Americans betraying fundamental principles, the diplomatic dance he has to perform to keep U.S. support, while resisting American pressure to surrender his country. This is the impossible position Trump has created, where Ukraine has to simultaneously depend on American aid for survival, while resisting American diplomatic pressure for capitulation. And what options does Zelensky have here really? If he refuses Trump's demands, he risks losing American military support, which would be catastrophic for Ukrainian defense. If he accepts Trump's demands, he betrays his country's sovereignty and sets Ukraine up for future Russian aggression once Putin has rebuilt his forces and decided to take another bite out of Ukrainian territory. There are no good options, only choices between different kinds of disaster, and that's Trump's deliberate strategy, because it gives him maximum leverage to force Ukrainian concessions. This is coercive diplomacy directed at the wrong target. This is the United States using its power to bully an ally rather than to deter an enemy, and it represents a complete perversion of what American foreign policy is supposed to be about. We're supposed to use our power to protect democracies from authoritarian aggression, to strengthen the rules-based international order, to stand with people fighting for freedom against tyrants. Instead, Trump is using American power to help Putin achieve through diplomacy what he couldn't fully achieve through military force, to legitimize territorial conquest, to undermine Ukrainian resistance and European unity. The Europeans understand this, which is why they're offering reassurance that Ukraine doesn't need to give in to Putin or to Trump, trying desperately to hold the line on principles that America is abandoning. But European support alone may not be sufficient to sustain Ukrainian resistance indefinitely, and Putin knows this, which is why he's willing to keep grinding through his society's resources and lives, because he understands that Trump is doing his work for him by eroding Western unity and resolve. Every day that Trump attacks Zelensky and pressures Ukraine and frames Russian aggression as a problem that needs compromising rather than an atrocity that needs punishing, Putin gains ground politically even when he's losing ground militarily. This is asymmetric warfare, where Russia's brutality is matched by America's betrayal, where Ukrainian soldiers are fighting a two-front war against Russian invasion and American abandonment. And the cruelest part is that Trump claims he's motivated by concern for Ukrainian casualties, as if the way to stop people from dying is to give the killer what he wants rather than to stop the killer from killing. It's the logic of appeasing domestic abusers by telling their victims to just do what they're told, and then they won't get hurt anymore, completely ignoring that the abuse will continue and escalate precisely because it was rewarded. You know what Ukraine needs right now? Ukraine needs the weapon systems that can strike deep into Russian territory and destroy the logistics that enable Putin's war machine. Ukraine needs comprehensive sanctions on Russia that genuinely cripple its ability to wage war rather than symbolic measures with massive loopholes. Ukraine needs NATO membership or security guarantees with real teeth, with automatic military responses to future aggression rather than vague promises that dissolve the moment testing them becomes inconvenient. Ukraine needs the United States to use its enormous power to raise the costs of Russian aggression until Putin has no choice but to withdraw completely from Ukrainian territory. But that's not what Trump is providing, because Trump fundamentally doesn't want Ukraine to win. He wants the war to end on terms that allow him to claim victory and normalize relations with Russia, regardless of what that means for Ukrainian sovereignty or European security or the international principle that aggression should not be rewarded. Trump's priorities are personal relationships with Putin and business opportunities in getting a foreign policy win that he can brag about, and Ukrainian lives and freedom are just obstacles to achieving those objectives. The clip you watched should be played in every classroom, should be studied by every person trying to understand how democracies die, and how authoritarian aggression succeeds not just through military force, but through the collaboration of democratic leaders who betray their own principles for personal advantage. Kira Ruddick's voice should echo in your ears every time someone tries to sell you the line that Trump is being pragmatic about Ukraine, that he's just trying to end suffering, that his approach is realistic rather than what it obviously is, which is appeasement born from affinity for authoritarian power and contempt for democratic resistance. This is the moral test of our time, laid bare in one CNN segment, the question of whether democracies will defend each other against authoritarian aggression, or whether they'll abandon their allies the moment supporting them becomes expensive, or inconvenient, or politically complicated. Trump is failing that test catastrophically, and dragging American credibility and American honor down with him into the mud of collaboration with tyranny. And every single American who claims to love freedom and democracy needs to understand what's being done in their name right now, needs to rage against this betrayal with every fiber of their being, needs to demand that their representatives resist Trump's appeasement plan with the same courage that Ukrainian soldiers show every day on the front lines. Because if we let this happen, if we allow Trump to pressure Ukraine into surrendering territory and sovereignty to Russia, we will have proven that the democratic world lacks the will to defend its own values, that all our rhetoric about freedom and human rights and international law is just empty words that dissolve the moment they conflict with transactional deal-making. We will have told every person fighting for democracy against authoritarianism that they're on their own, that American support is conditional and will be withdrawn the moment a U.S. president decides it's no longer convenient. We will have betrayed not just Ukraine but every principle that supposedly defines what America stands for, and in doing so we will have hastened the collapse of the democratic world order and the rise of an international system where might makes right and the strong devour the weak with impunity. That Ukrainian MP sitting on CNN is telling you the truth about what's happening, is warning you about the catastrophe being engineered by the American president who claims to be pursuing peace. Listen to her, believe her, understand that her pain is justified and her resistance is righteous, and her country's fight is the front line of democracy against resurgent authoritarianism. And then demand better from your government. Demand that America live up to its stated values rather than betraying them for the sake of Trump's relationship with Putin. Because this is the moment, right now, when we decide what kind of country America will be and what kind of world we'll live in. Choose wisely, choose courageously, choose to stand with Ukraine against this grotesque betrayal dressed up as diplomacy, because history is watching and it will judge us harshly if we fail this test.